You may be seated. In a few moments, Brenda is going to lead us in our reading of Psalm 46. There's a funny little word that appears in this psalm 3 times, the Hebrew word Selah. In total, it appears in the book of Psalms 71 times and in the book of Habakkuk 3 times. Scholars are a little conflicted over the meaning of the word Selah. Some say that it means to lift up or exalt. Others suggest that it might be a musical notation that indicates silence or a pause. So for today's reading of Psalm 46, we want to make it a little bit interactive. So every time Brenda says Selah, we're all going to repeat Selah after her. So let's practice this a few times before it happens. Ready? Selah. 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 Great. Calling a time of remembrance. As we enter the holiday season, we can't help but remember those that we have lost. I know for me, Thanksgiving and Christmas will never be the same now that my brother is gone. But that doesn't mean that I want to forget him. None of us want to forget the ones that we love. And it's important that we take the time to honor their memories. It's important that we talk about that feeling of loss, that we grieve, and also that we remember the joy and the love that they brought into our lives. We have 2 stories and a poem that we want to share with you today. Between each moment of sharing, we'll have a brief moment of silence that I will start by chiming the singing bowl, and then I will end it by chiming the bowl again. After this, if anyone else that didn't have a chance to talk to me wants to come up and share a brief story or a poem about a loved one that's passed away, you may take that moment to do so. So the first sharing today is a poem that I wrote about my grandmother. The title of this poem is Ashes and Photographs. I have pictures of my grandmother holding me as a baby. She died before my first birthday. In one of the pictures, my mother is pregnant with my sister. My grandmother never got to hold my sister. My sister was never held by my grandmother. Does that make me lucky to have been held by my grandmother, even though I can't remember it? I guess it does. I can't remember it, but I have pictures of my grandmother holding me as a baby, holding me so that I face the camera. See? See? This is my grandson. My mother says she was an excellent cook. Maybe that's where I get it from. She's still with us in a way, on the mantle. A little brown box. Sometimes I trace my finger on the engraving. Luan Eng Wei, 1915 to 1980. Sometimes I talk to her. Generations of ancestor worship are hard to set aside. Ashes and photographs. That's all that's left of her. She held me once. I can't remember it, but I have proof that she did. She did. And she smiled. I would now like to invite Liz Gunderson up to share her story.
Thank you, Charles. Dementia in a parent has been an unwelcome visitor to many of you. It certainly swept into my life with the force of a storm. My parents had to be moved from New Hampshire to Helena, where we found a small house for them to live. My mom's Alzheimer's became steadily worse, with confusion and anger attacks increasing. My dad stayed his usual gentle self, but he completely lost his short-term memory. My mom had been a third grade teacher, smart and funny, and a whiz at teaching math. My dad was an artist and a wonderful pianist. As they lost their ability to manage, they told me they trusted me completely with their care, which was a huge responsibility, but very empowering. As through the next 8 years, they went from managing with some help to mom's placement in a nursing home, and dad with his piano living with us. And they died within months of each other. I carried one major sorrow. My once wonderful, caring social parents were not able to form any real emotional connection with anyone new, and this included my son. This tore me apart. They had lost the ability to pass on the stories of their lives, so I then became their storyteller over and over. The stories of their own childhoods as told to me, their careers, and stories from my childhood. Cody would listen, and they would nod along as recollections dawned and faded again. Fortunately, Dad's memory for music stayed intact to the end of his life. Even when he lived with us in a spare bedroom, he played softly on his bedside electronic keyboard on waking and again before going to sleep as we all listened. I worry that the prolonged and difficult years of caretaking would damage us as a family, but as unrealistic expectations moderated and were replaced by acceptance, the repeated stories became the touchstones of our family history. I realized that we had been strengthened, and my dad's music formed the background to that. My son never did form a strong attachment to my parents, but years later, something interesting happened. He has found his life's work as a smart and funny third grade teacher, a whiz at teaching math. And he has a piano next to his classroom desk that he plays for his students. And that is the power of family stories, and that is the power of music.
I'd now like to invite Hal Fossum up to share his story.
My parents are today 89 and 95. They died 13 and 10 years ago. I'm sometimes visited by them in this church. I mean, visually and audibly, I remember them in their prime. And I remember the energy and joy they brought to and took from this church. It really drove them. My parents met in a choir loft in the Congregational Church in Great Falls and married and moved to Helena. Had 2 kids, me the second, in 1959, and in 1960, they began a nascent congregation that would become Plymouth. In 1960, we met in the old schoolhouse of the Intermountain that sat where Dillard's was. And my earliest memories are of when I was 1 in that building. I remember the building of this church and the incredible energy and joy that people brought to it. You may recognize some of these names. I hope you do. Nelson, Dunkel, Coggeshall, Bobbington, and I believe shortly Sheldon, Burkhart, my parents' great friends, Canning and Wooster. You would not believe the energy that went into this. The first budget of the church, I think, totaled $8,000, and that included the mortgage for the building costs. And I remember very well my father's pride in having been the first choir director, and my parents never did not sing in the Plymouth choir, and I just cannot bring myself to not sing in the Plymouth choir. I think I was born there, and in a very real sense, I was born in this church, came of age in this church, and I'm eternally grateful to those who went before us to make such a vital place, such a beautiful space, such a vital congregation. And finally, I remember my mother's regular exhortations that it was very important to worship, to go to church. It was very important. She kept emphasizing that throughout my life, and I do believe it's true. She thought that it was elemental to becoming a full person. So I remember my parents with gratitude. Thank you.
Before I open this up for more stories from the congregation, I do want to talk about my brother. Probably none of you know about this yet. He did complete suicide about 2 years ago. And it's something that, I haven't talked about that much with a lot of people. It's one of those things that when it happens, you never think that it's going to happen to your family. It's always, some statistic that you hear about on the news or in the newspaper. And it's hard. His name is James. I have his picture up here on the altar today. Growing up, we were total opposites. In some ways, we say James is a little bit of a black sheep. He just liked to get into trouble. He liked to argue. He was incredibly stubborn, very passionate about a lot of things. But as with a lot of siblings, as you grow older, your emotions temper, you start to get along. And as adults, we were very good friends. He cared so much about the people around him. He has 2 sons, one who just joined the Army, and one who is graduating high school soon. And he loved those kids. He tried so hard to give them everything. And he knew that he had anger issues, and he knew that he had substance issues, and he met with a group and tried to get other people through it and talk it out. And just be a support for others. But in the end, he succumbed to those things. And so I will always miss him. So at this time, if there's anyone else that would like to share a brief story or poem about a loved one who's passed away, I invite you to do that now. It's totally fine if nobody feels like sharing today. We'll just have a brief moment of silence, and I will end this time with the singing bowl.
Well, our family has three pictures up here today. One of Steve's mom and dad, and one of my mom. And I have a story about Steve's dad that I would like to share. Steve and I met in college, and it was still fairly new that I had lost my dad about 4 years before. And that was still pretty fragile and pretty near to the surface all the time. So Steve takes me out to the ranch to meet his mom and dad on Valentine's Day. And he is in the kitchen with his mom and gave her her Valentine. And so I was in the living room with John. And John said, "So you are the Sunny Ray that we've heard about." I said, "I am." He said, "Okay, I have a few questions. Do you go to church?" I said, "I do." "Do you drink?" "Well, I'm in college." "Yeah, a little." "Do you smoke?" "No, I don't smoke." "Do you belong to the Masonic family?" I said, "Yes, I'm a rainbow girl. My sister is also, and my mom and dad were involved in the Masonic family." How do you vote?" "Oh, well, depends on the candidate, but I tend to vote on the Republican side, but I've been known to vote both sides." "Well, I guess you can stay." And I stayed. I truly think John replaced my dad as my dad. We had great conversations and great memories of holidays and times on the ranch. Our daughter, Jonna, is named after him and after my brother, John. And he just always has had a soft spot in my heart. My mom, and you know Mom, she was active in our church, and we joined here soon after the church was chartered and begun. We weren't doing well at another church, and many of us came here kind of almost in bulk. But I remember growing up in the youth group with Bill Burkhart. I babysat the Burkhart girls, and Mom wasn't as active as I was until she retired. But the memory I have of Mom, she had a tradition when our daughters, Megan and Jonna, and my nieces, Lindsay and Shannon, started going to middle school and high school. And Mom was within walking distance of the junior high and Helena High. And she started a tradition on Friday afternoon. And they would all four come to her house for tea, always homemade cookies, of course, and conversation. And one day my sister and I said, Mom, can we come to tea? The girls said, no. What's visited with grandma stays with grandma. And my sister and I always said, you know, we were not ever worried about if something were to happen to us. The glue that those girls were spread with those conversations on Friday afternoon over tea have cemented their relationships so strongly that I don't think anything would ever come between the four of them. If anything were to happen to parents or relatives or anything, those four are just absolutely more like sisters than cousins. And I thank Mom for that.
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lucinda Sheldon. And in many ways, this is a homecoming for me. But I'm glad they mentioned the great cloud of witnesses, because that really is what this is. Up here, my brother and I have our parents' pictures. My mother was raised Catholic, but she had a lot of issues, as young people do, and was kind of lost as far as what her faith was. My dad, he had generations of Congregationalists in his background, although it turned out we have Baptists too, which would have upset my aunt to no end. But anyway, so she met my dad in college, and her parents did not want her to date a Protestant. And, but anyway, they finally relented and they were married, and they were married 56 years. So they were actually married by a man named Guy Barnes. Some of you might know who that is. He was actually called out of retirement to become the first minister here. And then when age 8, down at the Van Orsdale Hall, I was finally baptized because my mother couldn't bring herself to have me baptized in some church that she wasn't comfortable in. And so I have a picture of Guy Barnes signing a baptismal certificate. I don't know if it's for Jay or if it's for me, but anyway, I was 8 years old and I took the picture, and it's probably was signing for Jay. I like to think it was for Jay. So, like I said, it's a great cloud of witnesses. And before Van Orsdale Hall, we actually met in people's homes. And I remember my mother clearing the living room and setting up a table with an open Bible and a candle so that we could have church service. Because they tried out all kinds of different churches in Helena and they never felt at home. So this was, like I said, it's a homecoming. And it's been pulling people home for a long time. And I hope it will continue in the future. So that's my story.
This is just a word for any person who has lost a child of any age. I have a picture of my niece up here who died at the age of 8. And when a child dies, again, regardless of the age, parents lose hopes and dreams and the opportunity to see the growth and love go on.
Thank you, everyone who shared your stories. I'm sure there are so many more stories, and I encourage you to share those during the fellowship after the service. So now we are going to have our musical reflection, and for this one, we'll invite you to stay seated. It is